All right, folks, in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome to wander in quietly, but we do have to get started so we can stay on time and have plenty of time for the Q&A. So as you're coming in, I'm going to be introducing the next panel, which is in the philosophy and psychology stream. There will be two panels back to back about this same theme. So there will be mine, and then Larry is chairing the next one. So we have 6 total presenters in the theme, but we'll do the first 3 as a set and then the second 3 as a set. We do have 2 remote presentations in this first set of 3, but let me just go ahead and let you know what those presentations will be. First, we have Andrea Andiloro of Swinburne University of Technology presenting Beyond the Ruins, a Heideggerian analysis of video games, technology, and the end of the world. Next up in person, we have Jacqueline Moran, Dr. Jacqueline Moran, with the existential significance of goals and Campbell's hero's journey. And then lastly, we have Vedant Sansare from Macquarie University, industry perspective on systems-driven moral game design. So very excited about this panel and excited to see what you all want to chat about. So we're going to start this first video, and then we'll let Jacqueline take over after that. All right, see you in the Discord. Full screen.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be here. My name is Andrea Andiloro, and I will be presenting my work in progress article titled Beyond the Ruins, a Heideggerian analysis of video games, technology, and the end of the world. So end of the world, apocalypse, post-apocalypse. When we hear these words as game scholars, we obviously start going to the countless game dealing with these themes. Games set in the post-apocalypse are almost too many to count, and regardless of the type of specific post-apocalypse we deal with, we must acknowledge that the end of the world is an extremely popular setting and theme, almost a video game trope, and perhaps these games might be said to constitute a genre in themselves. Many scholars have noted the popularity of the post-apocalypse in video games, and in his PhD dissertation, Moon argues that we find ourselves in the midst of a post-apocalyptic turn. Authors like Abraham, Chang, Kelly and Nardi, Megan Hall, and Conselman have looked at the post-apocalypse through the lens of eco-criticism, understanding post-apocalyptic themes and representations as an opportunity for ecological reflection. Other authors have instead approached the post-apocalypse in games as an ideological playground where the guardrails of contemporary life are removed and what remains is instead a stateless condition, a sort of neoliberal fantasy where one is solely responsible for themselves and their well-being, which is often equated with financial and material success. And finally, Spokes has also written about games set in the post-apocalypse as a site for the encounter with and contemplation of death by part of the player. And yet, when you look at these games, you may reasonably ask, what end are we talking about here? We see these games commonly feature populated places of dwelling, towns and cities with functioning societies. Commerce is also a constant presence in these games, whether as part of a barter system or of a currency-based system. Also very common is games featuring a large variety of factions, each presenting their own culture, which typically reflects aspects of current ideological formations, and Fallout here is obviously the most egregious example. So while I think authors researching the post-apocalypse in games have reached important and noteworthy conclusions, I also think that to this day, there is a lack of consideration of fundamental questions such as what is the meaning of the end of the world, or in other words, what is the meaning of end and what is the meaning of world. So I approach these questions and these themes inspired by phenomenology, where world is understood not in a physical, mathematical, geological, or astronomical sense, but rather as the contextual fabric where meaning is constructed and experienced. So it's sort of world is a framework for meaning. In other words, worlds are context for things, people, and events to appear as something. And where those things, people, and events to appear in other worlds, different worlds, they would be interpreted as something else potentially. So it follows from this definition that there may be a multitude of worlds and that worlds are different from worldhood. So following Heidegger, we understand world as the concrete, meaningful context or horizon within which entities are understood, or the totality of interconnected significance and practices that form our everyday experiences, whereas worldhood is the ontological condition or structure that makes the existence of instances of world possible. From this perspective, then, an end of the world is not really an end of existence, but rather an end of meaning, or to cite REM, the end of the world as we know it. And this is in fact in line with etymological analysis, which reveals the Greek term apocalypsis to mean not destruction or catastrophe, but rather an uncovering, or a revealing, or a disclosing. The apocalypse then is not just an end of the world, but is also, more importantly, the revelation of a new world, of a new domain of meaning. So the apocalypse is therefore also presenting a certain revolutionary potential, one might say. So, based on this understanding, I theorize three ways or three articulations of apocalyptic disclosure found in video games. I developed these models from Heidegger's writing on various models of annihilation and truth revealing found throughout his career. I identified video games of destruction, video games of devastation, and video games of releasement. So for this to make sense, we must look at Heidegger's differentiation between destruction and devastation. So he writes that destruction is a change in condition whereby something always remains preserved. Devastation instead is a far-reaching event through which any and all possibilities for something essential to arise and bloom in its dominion are suffocated at the root. And in what is called thinking, he writes that destruction only sweeps aside all that has grown up or been built up so far, but devastation blocks all future growth and prevents all building. So I understand destruction as ontic. One world is destroyed, but traces remain and may greatly influence what happens afterwards, whereas devastation is ontological. There is no room for something new to develop. Most representations of the post-apocalypse fall under the domain of games of destruction. The old world is merely reskinned, while the societal guardrails have been removed. The player acts as a neoliberal subject in a pseudo-state of nature characterized by techno-Darwinism. So those who, aided by technology, are most adaptable, survive, and thrive. And this condition is epitomized by the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout, which the player can join. As what is essentially a techno-fascist cult, the Brotherhood of Steel's goal is to retrieve old war technology and prevent it from failing into the hands of other factions who they deem irresponsible and unworthy of it. Games of devastation are those games that illustrate an ontological conclusion with no follow-up. Heidegger writes that devastation is a consequence of technology taking over completely the revealing of truth. Everything becomes enframed and revealed as standing reserved, objectified, while other modes of being are sealed off. And I find representatives of games of devastation in more experimental areas of game design. For example, The End of the World is an itch.io game of the interface genre. There's very little to do. The only instructions players are given is to not press the red button. And of course, players will press it, causing the Earth to explode and the game to end abruptly. I take this as an example of a game of devastation for a series of reasons. First, as an example of an interface game, the game is inherently technological in the Heideggerian way. Computer interfaces effectively direct our experience and allow for world disclosure along very strict paths while sealing off others. The appearance of the big button presents us with an irresistible affordance, reinforced by the fact that no other option is given to us. We then submit ourselves to the technological logic of the computer and cause world devastation. Finally, we have games of Gelassenheit, which is a term usually translated as releasement. This term is closely related to other crucial Heideggerian terms, such as thinking, freedom, and truth. Releasement is for Heidegger a different mode of thinking. Where technology as a mode of thinking and disclosing the world is a setting upon the world, actively trying to control it, releasement is a letting be. This letting be, however, is not passivity, but rather a deep involvement that is non-controlling, non-grasping, and non-dominating. It allows beings to reveal themselves in their own way rather than being forced into predefined categories. This mode of relating to things relates us to truth as freedom, where truth does not mean correspondence between an ideal content and a state of affair, but rather the possibility for being and beings to disclose themselves as they are. Once more, we must look at experimental games to find examples. In Afterworld's End, we play as an unnamed figure inhabiting a village after an event has caused the world to end. The game begins with the character stating that they want to go out rather than rot inside, and that going to the lake sounds like a good idea. On the path to the lake, the character reflects on past events, for example, how the media lied about the incoming end of the world, and how the rich of the world left Earth. Once they finally reach the lake, in Heideggerian fashion, the character says that they like coming to the lake to just think, and this thinking gives them hope. Afterworld's End is then expressive of Gelassenite, in that it represents the apocalypse as a transformative experience, not an end, but a transition, fostering adaptability to alternative realities post-collapse that do not solely replicate previous modes of being and social structures. Thinking here signifies letting things appear as they are, remaining open to new horizons and new opportunities that may originate at the end of the world. Through releasement, games can facilitate a unique engagement with the concept of the world's end. This interpretation aligns with Heidegger's perspective, which sees an end not as a terminus, but as a prelude to different beginnings, allowing players to navigate and find meaning in the aftermath of a world's conceptual end. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Do you like this? Is that okay? Yes, I can hold that.
It's a lot of hands. You kind of need three.
Oh,
Do you want me to stand here and change slides?
no, I'll just leave this on the table. Do I full screen this?
If you push
Oh,
present,
oh.
it should go.
If I push.
Yeah. Voila.
Okay. So, when's the timer stop? Just now? The timer stopped. Okay. Oops.
Yeah, let's go back to screen.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so hello, I'm Jacqueline Moran. I'm the Hero's Journey person. This time, my presentation is Hero's Journey plus Existentialism with an emphasis on goals. So when we talk about the hero's journey in video games, it's often as a player's journey, something to be experienced rather than witnessed. So the hero or the player begins in an ordinary world, is called to do something new, enters a special world, encounters challenges, succeeds against a significant ordeal, is rewarded, and they return to where they started, but better than before. This sequence has, this is the sequence we all know, and it has been, I think, rightly criticized, but there hasn't been enough criticism on the lack of connections between these stages. So when you mentally superimpose Star Wars onto this summary, which I'm sure you did, it sounds cohesive, but let's break this down. Oh, sorry, not enough connections. So the hero begins in a world that is in some way ordinary, is called to do something new for some reason, goes to some kind of special world, encounters some kind of challenges, succeeds against some significant ordeal somehow, is rewarded with something, and returns to the ordinary world better in some way. So these events are barely connected. And this is clear with Christopher Vogler's The Call to Adventure. So according to Christopher Vogler, the call just gets the story rolling after you've set it up. It doesn't need to be related to anything. In video game discourse, the call to adventure just contextualizes the first thing the player needs to do, and it can be immediately forgotten. It is just a catalyst that triggers off the main story. It's just a formality, and anything will do. And the refusal of the call is never really an option. Again, in Vogler's hero's journey, the hero may initially refuse, but they always accept. In video game discourse, it's either brief, performative, or entirely absent, because players really want to play the game. Others have creatively reinterpreted the refusal as something that just makes the adventure seem dangerous, just as a delay.
And even in this educational hero's journey, where additional stages were added to divert a player back onto the path, they say that an adamantly refusing player should just be forced onto the adventure, whether they want to or not. So this hero's journey does not define why these things happen in this order or how they are connected. But as I've said before, this is Christopher Vogler's hero's journey, and it is different from Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and Campbell does connect all his pieces. So everything in Campbell's hero's journey is defined by a goal. The hero is only a hero if they have a goal. Things are helpful or a hindrance in relation to a goal. Progress, regression, stagnation, errors, and success can only be judged by a goal. Campbell's call to adventure, or he calls it the herald, it makes the goal, it reveals the goal to the hero so they know it's there, and the hero can refuse and they might not change their mind. But I'm not saying Campbell's perfect, because this might be less linear than Vogler's, but Campbell's hero does not choose the goal. This is because Campbell's feelings and opinions, not the hero's, determines what the goal is. I can't remember, Campbell decides what could help the hero, what is hindering the hero, whether the hero is succeeding or failing, and why. The call may persuade the hero, but it's also there to punish misbehavior. So the adventure happens in a region of both treasure and danger. Do the right thing and you get treasure. Do the wrong thing and you get the danger. If the hero refuses, then the divinity itself becomes his terror. His flowering world becomes a wasteland of dry stones, and his life feels meaningless. To the unwilling or hesitant hero, the adventure is a journey of darkness, disgust, horror, and phantasmagoric fears. The unqualified and overbold hero, beyond their depth, will be shamelessly undone. And attempt the journey in the wrong way, and Campbell will acknowledge that you have guts, but you'll still fail. If the hero refuses to submit to the initiatory tests, the right way to do things, then the hero must either quit the adventure in a magic flight or be crucified like Prometheus. And this approach makes sense when we're talking about games as systems of predetermined systems of rules defining what the participants can do and cannot do, how elements behave and interact, and the rewards and punishments for actions. Like, it doesn't matter what you want. If you step into the lava, you're going to stop the game. And that's because Campbell is talking about training and interpolation and ideologies embedded in systems. But Campbell doesn't frame it that way. He argues that he is revealing a universal truth being taught to us by enlightened mythmakers. Only geniuses capable of the highest realization can understand the goal and succeed. Oh, sorry. The hero who rejects the goal is a clown, a mistaker of shadow for substance. Anyone unable to understand a god sees it as a devil. And the crux of the curious difficulty lies in the fact that our conscious views of what life ought to be seldom correspond to what life really is. Campbell is very judgy, and this could describe a trainer's perspective, but not so much the trainees, especially if they do not want the training. But this is an easy problem to fix because Campbell uses his perspective to decide the goal and define the world and judge the hero. But instead, if we make it the hero's perspective, what the hero cares about, then the goal, then to define the goal in the world, then Campbell's hero's journey is less about evaluation and more about experience. And we can do this by approaching Campbell's hero's journey phenomenologically to consider the hero as an experiencing subject. I think I've just got a few minutes left and now I'm finally getting into some theory. Existential ludology uses existential philosophy and existential phenomenology to discuss how we engage with and experience video games. So we step into a virtual subjectivity, into a being in a virtual world, when we engage with a digital environment and accept it as an existential situation, as a set of facts that influence our existence. Your virtual subjectivity organizes the digital environment into a meaningful world where you can plan and act, and it discloses possibilities for meanings and actions. Ludic subjectivity refers to one's existence towards and within a game world. To be a being in the game world is to be a certain way made possible by the game. Your ludic subjectivity makes sense of the digital game. And ludic subjectivity is structured by the ludic subject position, which includes our basic bodily anchorings, the capabilities and limitations we are granted over the digital environment, the fit between our abilities and the environment, the ways the environment can act upon us, and our goals. Okay, I can tell which one's your favorite, but I do want to focus on goals. Human existence is always oriented towards future possibilities, towards our goals and our projects. To be what Helm calls a genuine agent is for something to be of import to you, to be worthy of your attention and your action. Projects give our subjectivity form and direction, and it is only through that projectual disposition that things are meaningful to us as obstacles, equipment, or sub-goals. So we map our projects and our abilities onto our environment, and this is how any environment can appear to us as adverse or helpful. As Gadamer said, famously, all play is a being played. That's because trying to succeed at some task or goal by submitting to the rules and the regulations of the game, the player inhabits a mode of being. Intentionality refers to how we direct ourselves towards things, for things to matter and be significant to us, and that includes our goals. Our intentionality in most cases is effective. You have a passive emotional response towards your intentional objects, feeling pleasures and pains in response to that import. And emotions motivate us. They motivate us to act. If you care about something, then you will be vigilant for circumstances affecting it favorably or adversely, and you will be prepared to act on its behalf. Oh, sorry, I'm a little bit behind there. But on one hand now, a video game can instill, simulate, and otherwise produce the effective intentionality that will commit us to a subjectivity. And a video game materially affords actions and makes certain projects possible. But single-player video games are playful artifacts onto which we project gameness. So there's no inherently correct way to engage with a video game artifact. And our ludic subject position, which shapes our ludic subjectivity, comprises more than just the video game artifact. Our ludic subject position includes our cultural capital, our gaming knowledge, our gender norms and identity, and really anything else comprising our facticity and existential situation, which is our concrete, inescapably contingent yet worldly involved aspect of the human existence in which we are situated. So Breath of the Wild isn't designed to encourage me to want to jump into lava, but I might also have masochistic and self-destructive urges because I'm multifaceted. And the game can't stop me from wanting that. So the ludic subject position, your sense of existence, your being, and what anything means to you, which structures your ludic subjectivity while engaging with a video game, is formed by your entire historical, social, cultural, and personal context. So I argue that Campbell's hero's journey already aligns quite well with existential phenomenology. Goals as projects shape our existence and make things meaningful as help and hindrance. It's just that Campbell focuses on finding the true meaning in myth, and he overlooks his own situatedness, which means he overlooks the situatedness of what he considered goals. If we just reframe the goal as the intentional object of an experiencing hero's subject, then Campbell's hero's journey is much more applicable to play experiences, or at least explicitly goal-oriented play experiences. And then we can interrogate something that Campbell doesn't consider, how something becomes a goal for a player, or how it becomes a goal for a hero, how a player comes to care about something for it to become a goal for them to form a hero's journey. And that's it. Thank you.
All right. So we have yet another video for you. All right. Let me mute it.
My name is Vedant, and today I'm going to be presenting my research on how game developers approach moral gameplay, particularly differences between scripted and systems-driven moral gameplay, and how it compares with academic theory. So a fair bit of research highlights the potential of systems-driven moral play from a theoretical perspective. But in practice, we do see industry professionals as well as academic games tending to favor scripted moral structures more. And my study kind of examined why this gap exists. So to do this, I conducted interviews with developers to understand how they design moral gameplay, the challenges they face, and how their perspectives compare to academic theory. So I'll start by briefly going over the distinction between scripted and systems-driven moral game design, like what do I actually mean by it, then move on to the research question, the methods, and the findings. So scripted design kind of relies on predefined moral choices that are explicitly framed by the developer. And you can kind of see example of this in many commercial games. So such as the Mass Effect series, most of the Telltale games, Fallout 3, Fallout 4. In all of these, the game kind of gives you a moral scenario. It gives you a set of choices, a set of options, and then you kind of pick and choose among these choices, among these options. You pick a choice, the game gives you a pre-authored outcome, which is controlled by the designer, and then you move on to the next scenario. So a good thing about the scripted design paradigm is that because everything is designer control, the designer has complete authorial control over the game. They can kind of tailor the experience, and most players will have similar experiences to each other. Unfortunately, that comes with the drawback of not being allowed to go beyond the constraints of the set number of choices which are presented to the player. On the other hand, we have systems-driven design, where instead the player actions and the game's mechanics generate the ethical dilemmas through the interplay between each other. So, for example, we have in this War of Mine and Rimworld, in both of these games, the moral choices are kind of woven into the mechanics rather than the dialogue options. So decisions like whether to steal supplies from other survivors, or to leave an uninjured character behind, or to steal organs from the people who are in your colony who come to you for help, and you can sell the organs for the benefit of your colony to the world. It's a bit drastic. So here, the decisions are not explicitly framed as moral choices, but can still feel ethically significant for the player. So a section of academic literature kind of advocates for this type of systems-driven design, such as Rand's length of toy approach, Borges' procedural rhetoric, Sickard's emphasis on player agency. But in practice, or in the opinion of industry professionals, they tend to favor the scripted moral play a tad more. And we kind of see this in academic games as well, where the scripted moral play is favored a tad more. And this kind of raises an important question as to why that happens, right? So for this, I turn towards the industry perspective. And the question I asked was, how do industry professionals perceive the differences between the two design approaches? And what challenges do they face in their implementation? So, to achieve this, I interviewed 9 game developers from AAA and indie studios to capture kind of different perspectives across production scale. Participants were primarily based in North America, Europe, and Australia, which also kind of means that the findings reflect a Western industry perspective. I would have loved to have more Asian representation, but unfortunately, the professional network, I was constrained by the professional network, so I was not able to recruit Japanese, Korean, or Chinese devs. I would have loved to have their perspective on how they approach moral gameplay. So I conducted semi-structured interviews where I had a set of guiding questions, but gave the developers enough flexibility to expand on the topics as needed. And for analysis, I used thematic coding to identify key patterns in the perspectives. To compare existing academic theory, I used deductive coding, while inductive coding allowed new things to emerge from the developer's insights. Now, the findings from this research the first finding was that the scripted and systemic design is not actually a binary distinction, but rather a spectrum. So the industry perspective was that games, or most games, kind of reside somewhere between scripted and system-driven design and don't necessarily fall into a bucket called scripted gameplay or systemic gameplay. Some of the examples which they gave was about Life is Strange, where players kind of navigate predetermined moral dilemmas. So one end of the spectrum, you have games like these. On the other hand, you have RimWorld, which is a bit more player-driven, and the moral scenarios and moral choices are kind of the product of the game mechanics and the game dynamics. But somewhere between the spectrum, some example of game which reside in the middle of the spectrum or somewhere between these two ends is like Stanley Parable. So Stanley Parable kind of blends scripted narratives with player-driven choices, where while the game has numerous pre-written paths and outcomes, it also reacts to the player choices in unexpected manners, right? Because the narrative kind of comments on what the player is doing if they go away from a predetermined path. The second finding was that systemic moral play is engaging and viable, but it does require some scaffolding. So developers acknowledged that systemic moral play leads to immersion, player-driven ethics, which can be engaging, but they do need some level of narrative framing to help the players recognize the moral stake. So an example which was provided by one of the developers was that while they agreed with this philosophy of system-driven play, they mentioned that they needed to, that during the playtesting, they needed to add explicit signposting because the player did not know that they were inside a moral scenario. So even if we want a bit more implicit hidden moral engagement, uh, in practice, the players do need explicit signposting to show that they are involved in a moral scenario. The third finding was varying priorities for moral dilemmas. So some players tend to reflect on the morality of the scenario, morality of the situation, while others tend to prioritize the gameplay loop. So some will reflect on the ethical weight of the choices, while others will approach this purely through a mechanical lens. And again, one of the examples provided by the developers was about Fallout 3. Because in Fallout 3, uh, you can kill a lot of civilians, you can kill a lot of innocents, but you can and rake a lot of bad karma, and then you can balance it and wash away your entire sins by going to a religious place and then paying piety, right? So it's mostly transactional morality. And finally, another constraint which was raised regarding systems-driven design was about technical and narrative constraints, as well as the design complexity involved with creating a system which supports multiple model scenarios. So one of the points raised was that it's difficult to create a system or a set of systems which can actually support different moral philosophies and work in conjunction with players' interaction with them to create varied moral scenarios. And the other side to this, or another point along with this, was the difficulty in controlling the narrative pacing and the storytelling, because you're kind of relying on the player's interpretation of the choices they're making. And if they take the wrong lessons, then you're kind of going away from the player experience which the designer wanted to convey. So these are some of the findings which I found out in terms of why system-driven game design is not quite favored in industry setting. And this kind of gets exacerbated when we go to academia, because if you're trying to make an academic moral game where you want to teach uh, ethics or want the player to reflect in a certain manner, you do want to have controlled lessons. And if you're using a too open-ended system, then the player may take the wrong lesson or go away from what you want to actually convey as a designer. So that's about it for me. Thank you, Anish, for coming, and I can take questions.
comes into play with the hero's journey or with Heidegger or with any of these moral dilemmas we've been talking about. So Bonnie Ruber and Jack Halberstam, for example, is thinking about that. So
Yeah, okay.
I was writing a response, I was waiting for the presentation to finish, but I'll just say it now. I was typing in that Campbell, seeing a queer reading, would say, "You've misunderstood." I think Campbell's hero's journey has already been like Vogel's hero's journey has been critiqued as this, but also I think from what I could read of critiques of Campbell is that it's extremely heteronormative. So he includes lots and lots of ways to fail, and he treats them as genuine fails. Like, you should not do this. I think combining that with queer theory would be to take those failures seriously and say it's more useful to, like, the failures are more interesting. And he kind of almost flirts with the idea of the failures being more interesting. Like, he has a soft spot for it. I think there's a story about a like the god of the sun. I can't say any of these Greek names, but the god of the sun. No, like Phaethon. Phaethon has a son who drives his chariot, but he's really bad at it, and he almost burns the world and does burn himself. But Campbell says at least he tried. So Campbell seems to like the bravery that goes into it, but he ultimately says you shouldn't do this. So I would say he would disapprove of queer theory, but I think queer theory could make his hero's journey way more interesting. Because yes.
I know you keep going.
No, I wonder whether the two people on Zoom, are they able to talk through Zoom?
someone did say something about queer Heidegger feels cursed, agreed, and followed, but he would still be a Nazi, true. But yeah, so if anyone who's joined online wants to answer either in the Zoom chat or on Discord, but or you can speak up. I think we will probably be able to hear you if you're on Zoom. So I have one here, one back there, and then you. Okay.
All right. Thanks. Yeah, Jackie, this question is for you. Great paper, really good argument. I just wonder though whether I wonder if, like, with the transition from the hero's journey to the existential project, whether something you might have lost in that transition is like the unconscious element of the journey or the project. Insofar as like obviously Campbell does the worst kind of psychoanalytic theory, like Jungian theory, but there is like an unconscious element to the journey in that, like, the hero is not choosing the journey in a conscious sense. They're kind of making an unconscious choice, which feels deterministic. And with your shift to existential ludology or subjectivity, I wonder if you sort of like pulled the unconscious away, where you're talking about like conscious decisions. So I just, yeah, well, I'm just interested in, like, you're always talking about different things, right? So I just wonder what you think about. Yeah.
I intentionally lean away from the psychoanalytic side of it, mostly because I'm addressing the way the hero's journey is adopted into video games, which never uses proper psychoanalysis. It's always interpreting it as a narrative model. Like, so how do we put this into narrative? What does this mean for narrative? And so I try to use theories that could maybe address that narrative approach a bit more. But I completely agree with you that Campbell, in his, to say a generously eclectic approach to psychoanalysis, is suggesting that the things that we are in a way forced to do are things that our unconscious is telling us to do. But he is also being a very dictatorial therapist, saying, I'm going to tell you what you deep down want to do. So I think Campbell's messy use and understanding of psychoanalysis at the time, because this was, I think, the first solo author book he wrote, and it was like at the very beginning of his like 40-year academic career almost. So his understanding and views of especially Jungian psychology did change a lot to the very end of his life. So at least when he wrote that one book, he had quite a messy, not exactly fully agreeing with Jung, also kind of dabbling in Freud, but like through Rohan, it's confusing. So I don't think Campbell's use of psychoanalysis is developed enough for a use of psychoanalysis to be totally confirming or like aligning with him. I think a psychoanalyst would need to like do the heavy lifting themselves and try to make sense of Campbell.
Okay, thanks for that. my question was actually quite close, if not the same as the one that you just asked. I wanted to ask you about the archetypal view of the hero's journey, and specifically about the unconscious and whether you actually thought about that and whether that could bring any value to it. But you've answered that. I did have a question for Andreas, which was generally given the model that he's proposed. I was just actually quite curious about whether he's got what his favorite games are and whether any of them, whether his research has made him see those games in a slightly different way, if any of them happen to be narratives of the post-apocalypse.
What my favorite games are? Well, I guess I am interested in post-apocalyptic games. I mean, primarily Fallout. I really like Fallout. But I guess that you know, because in my talk and generally, you know, if I'm then looking at the game from an analytical perspective and trying to understand what's it trying to say about, you know, current society and trying to, you know, critique it, then obviously there's lots that it can be critiqued for that doesn't necessarily detract from my enjoyment of playing the game. But it is interesting, I think, that in this framework, those works that really push the boundaries and that really sort of say something interesting, or I would say more important about, you know, the apocalypse and the post-apocalypse, those games tend to be, you know, small projects, indie projects, more artistic type of games. So yeah, I just find interesting how those, you know, bigger commercial titles have this really simplistic understanding of the post-apocalypse, whereas yeah, smaller projects are able to sort of, you know, unconceal, to use a Heideggerian term, something deeper about the theme. I don't know if that answers the question.
Seems good.
Oh, I've got one for Jackie. So in the detective board game genre, you are inundated with leads, and you have a limited amount of time, so you are supposed to say no. You are supposed to say no to the call of adventure. You are supposed to engage in multiple calls, refusals of the calls, and that's actually part of the gameplay mechanics. I'm wondering, does that count as a refusal of the call, or as like a way of putting the refusal of the call as a gameplay mechanic?
I think this is maybe a question of like genre differences, like whether the other detective genre is appreciably similar to an essentially adventure or quest genre, which is more Campbell, not intentionally. Like Campbell did not write this talking about how to write narrative. He was writing a self-help book about how to read myth to make sense of your life, and it's been adopted into narrative writing. So I don't know, like maybe my slightly bullshit answer is maybe that solving the crime is the journey, and so whatever you need to do to solve it will solve it, even if it involves rejecting some clues, I guess.
Yeah, I have a question for Andrea. It's Ryan. Basically, I was curious. Somebody mentioned DayZ in the Discord in relation to post-apocalyptic stuff. And it sort of made me think that a lot of the examples you threw up and were talking about, at least, were games that seemed to have a pretty large emphasis on narrative in some form or another, you know, like Last of Us, Stalker, Metro, you know, adaptations of books in there, and things that have been adapted into films and shows and stuff. I was curious what your thoughts about how your model would fit to games that are sort of more far more sort of open-ended and less like sort of authored narrative and more emergent narrative, or sort of lacking narrative to a certain extent, how that would work.
I guess it would depend much on genre. So I'm thinking of something like DayZ, maybe that is more sort of traditional survival, zombie post-apocalypse game. I find that often survival games sort of implicitly embrace that, I guess, I don't know, a neoliberal framework where there is just one guy, because typically it's a guy, of course, solely relied for themselves, that has to take care of themselves, and there is absolutely no government. Everything has gone to shit. There is no structure there to sustain the individual. So it's fully individualized subject. And to me, that sounds very neoliberal. So I don't know if a lack of narrative or a game with a lack of narrative that might say something deeper about the post-apocalypse. I think that narrative, even minimal degree of narrative, can be very useful, however, to unconceal and say something different about what happens after the post-apocalypse. Okay, there is no more government. Everything has fallen down. But can we rebuild something new and something better, or are we just sort of repeating the cycle, or perhaps even, I guess, going towards something worse than what we already have? So to answer your question, I find lots of value in narrative. I think that it can be used to say some pretty important, deep and meaningful things that maybe can point towards something else. And those are the games that I tend to play the most. So I typically like a good story. So yeah.
Thanks all. Really great panel. Question for Vedant. I was really interested in the idea of going and speaking to industry developers about, I guess, these academic kind of categories or terms. So I guess I'm really curious to hear whether the devs were ever just like, I don't care about academic game studies. Like, what are you talking about? I just go make my interactive multiple endings or whatnot. So I guess I'm just really curious about kind of the enthusiasm or cynicism from your participants about just engaging with these kind of academic terms you were asking them about.
So regarding academic terms, they did not specifically mention them as scripted or system-driven games. They were mostly describing them in terms of how much agency the player has. So they weren't that repetitive academic terms, but they mostly used industry terms for those in terms of like how much freedom the player has, how much does it actually involve playtesting, how much is it feasible when it gets into the player's hands, and it was less about like how much it goes into like academic design. Did that kind of answer your question?
We got a thumbs up. As you can see, the Zoom chat's very quiet. Anyone else in the room? Oh, they're up here and then.
This is one for Andrea. I was just wondering, can multiple applications of your frames be applied to like one media? So like, for example, like for like, the Brotherhood of Steel, which is like destruction, the idea of rebuilding what they already had before. But then you also have like Children of Adam in there as well, and they're kind of like discussing height, where they're trying to like rebuild like a new version of the world.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please? I couldn't hear very well.
Oh, so yeah, so like can multiple applications of your frames be applied to like the one bit of media? So like, for example, in the Fallout series, you have the Brotherhood of Steel as like destruction, but then the Children of Adam, which is like another fact, like they're kind of building, like looking to like rebuild the world like through atomic power.
Sorry, I'm thinking. Yeah, sure, why not? I mean, I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but that is definitely something interesting. Yeah, I'd have to have a thought about it, but thanks for the suggestion. So yeah, having different, I guess applying that to the Fallout example, how different factions may embody these different positions with regard to the post-apocalypse. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would have to think more about it, but it's definitely something interesting to consider. Thank you.
I've got a quick question for Vedant again about your presentation. I'm interested in knowing how you go about balancing moral design between systems-driven and scripted types of games. I mean, what's the sweet spot and how do you calibrate that? it seemed from the data you're presenting that a lot of it was very kind of courses for courses. That is quite preferential on what people want. The safety of a very scripted story versus the unpredictability of a systems-driven experience. How do you balance the tension between those two things? In other words, what are you planning on doing next as well?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Simple version, how do you balance those two spheres of systems-driven moral design? How do you balance moral
Right.
system-driven games versus scripted games?
Right. So both of them have their advantages and disadvantages, scripted and systems-driven games. Most of my research was about systems-driven games, and unfortunately, one of the caveats of systems-driven design was that it kind of causes ethical fading for the player because they get involved with the systems of the game, like the toy of the game, and that's why you kind of need the scripted scaffolding. So the second part of my PhD, so this was the first stage. The interviews, the second stage was actually what you mentioned was how to actually integrate scripted and systems-driven design, like how to use the scripted scaffolding for systems-driven design. And the answer was kind of you need like semiotic layers for systems-driven gameplay. So you kind of say that the bar is going up and down when you take damage, or you're choosing something which is morally right or morally wrong. You need kind of like semiotic scaffolding so that the player actually cares about the things when they are doing making systemic choices. But you kind of cannot have a game which is completely scripted. It can lean towards more scripted design, or you can lean towards more systems-driven design. But what I found was that it kind of lies somewhere on the spectrum. So you kind of need scripted scaffolding, narrative scaffolding, along with systems-driven design, so the player actually cares about the morality of the game world. Did that answer your question?
Thank you for your presentations. My question is for Jackie, and just in the end, that sort of situation of like different contexts for subjectivities that can emerge in, and sort of this idea of like contexts giving rise to subjectivities and understanding subjectivity there. There's sort of, at least it looks like there's maybe a theoretical sort of split that's forming between like the sort of the psychoanalytic, like, you know, Jungian, Freudian thing, just like the subject is kind of primary and then it retroactively looks onto those constitutive forces and gives a kind of a mythic quality, you know, like Freud's sort of stages of development, etc. Versus the kind of more post-structuralist, like we're looking at the material world and how that produces these emergent subjectivities. And as someone who's gone through, you know, you encounter this stuff, you read it. These two camps really don't gel with each other, and it's sort of, it seems like there's, you know, do you feel like as your work progresses, you will be forced to choose a side, or are you trying to square the circle and find some way to have these two camps that don't like each other? You know, the subject as primary and the subject as emergent and secondary. Like, are you looking for a way to have them mesh? I guess that's sort of the question there.
I, at the current moment, do not have sufficient knowledge of either of these camps to act as mediator, but I think the existential approach perhaps has more. Okay, I don't know. I was going to try to come up with a preliminary idea, but maybe I don't really have any. But that is a really good point, because as Ben said before, that this particular analysis that I did in this presentation, it does kind of ignore all of the like messy but still fruitful psychoanalysis that Campbell does engage with. And I did have to kind of make that decision, but maybe there is like a happy, peaceful solution. Like, I don't know. Okay, Ben's frowning. I'm going to say no.
I just feel like there is a synthesis, which is that the project, the existential project, is unconscious. Like, I think that you were sort of talking about the project as like a conscious project.
Yeah,
I think it's an unconscious project.
Yeah, I think especially Helm and Slavey, I think, are the main ones that I cite that talk most about the project being a mood, about how you can't consciously control it, and that there is a difference between an emotive, like affective and intentionality compared to very conscious, rational instruction following. Like I think Helm, I think I use the term genuine agent, and if I'm recalling correctly, he used that to differentiate between an agent that just mechanically follows instructions, which is undifferentiated from like a machine, compared to someone with a mood that like cares about something, that you come to care about, like wanting this or wanting that, rather than just like logically deciding this is a goal. Like there is no logical goal, it's just all what you want. So I'm saying that psychoanalysis could. Oh, sorry, I'm asking you a question.
No, my answer is too much.
No,
to that
no,
question.
no. No, you're helping me answer. Thank you.
I was thinking
So-
about Undertale, because like if you're gonna do the genocide route, then you have to sort of put aside some of your proclivities when it comes to like, I love certain characters and I want to kill them, but I want to see the content and I want to have the achievement.
Yeah, I mean, if machine go bad, then psychoanalytic, like that's drifting away, but you know, the Oedipus stuff, and leading more into the conscious as the source of the solution to this. So
We can make the narratologist and the ludologist play nice together, maybe you can adjust it.
Have we made them play nice, or have we just rejected all the languages?
That was for you, Cass.
Throw me into this.
Yeah, with the unconscious and conscious, like as a player, you are making these conscious decisions. So how does that like directly affect that hero's journey? Like, is it something, or not the hero's journey, but Campbell's ideally?
Well, from Campbell's perspective, he thinks there's this inner, from one interpretation that he's using, there is an inner need that you need fulfilled, and your conscious self needs to come to realize that. But he also talks very metaphysically, like saying God and the universe have this just way of being, a way of existing that you need to align with, and you need to see your place in the universe, which is where the psychoanalysis gets kind of muddled for me. Like I'm not really sure how he's lining those up. But I think Campbell would say there is some like deep need that you need to come to terms with. So to him, it's not a conscious choice in that sense. It's like following your inner psyche, or you're doing what God says, or you're following your society, or you're just obeying the laws of nature. That's how he's interpreting all of these things. Like he's kind of like saying these are all symbols of each other.
All right, folks, we're out of time for this one, so can we give a last round of applause? All right, we're gonna do a quick transition. I'm gonna turn off the mic for that. Oh, no. All right, I'm just gonna get out of the way.